I want you to picture a 4-year-old black boy in preschool named Joe who loves trucks and blocks. He's been sent home twice this week for aggressive behavior, while other children who hit or push get reminders and stay in the classroom. His family hears maybe this just isn't the right fit. As an early childhood educator, I've seen this too many times. What's happening here is implicit bias, which is what Wymer et al. In their article published by the National Association of Educators for Young Children in 2020 states as when our minds make quick, automatic judgments about people based on things like race, gender, age, or disability, even when we honestly believe everyone should be treated fairly. According to that same article, stories like this are not rare. Research shows that Black children make up 18% of preschoolers, yet 42% of all suspended preschoolers are Black. Many of us will work with people and organizations that shape children's lives, either as educators, administrators, parents, or communicators. What happens in early childhood education classrooms doesn't just affect one child, it shapes our communities. I've worked in the early childhood setting for the past 5 years, including diverse military childcare systems, and I've loved it. I've also been the oldest of three, a mother and a teacher. I know every child deserves to feel like they belong in the classroom. To combat implicit bias in early childhood classrooms, we must recognize how it shows up in discipline, understand that it's rooted in systems rather than children, and commit to educator centered practices. First, I'll explain what implicit bias looks like in early childhood discipline. Second, I'll show why this is a systems and support problem, not a bad kid problem. And finally, I'll share practical strategies that educators and communities can use to reduce bias and keep children in school. Let's talk about how implicit bias shows up in discipline. The pattern is clear. Wymer et al.'s NAEYC article in 2020 and Garo et al.'s article in Contemporary School Psychology Journal, written by professors of advanced psychology in 2019, state that Black preschoolers face suspension and expulsion rates at 3 times than their white peers, even in programs serving 3 and 4-year-olds. This starts the school to prison pipeline. How does this happen? A qualitative study in the journal Issues in Teacher Education Spring 2022 by Chu et al., professors in special education, gave pre-service and practicing special education teachers an implicit association test. This test measured participants' implicit bias through responses according to a stereotype or attitude about a particular group. Many of these pre-service and in-service teachers were shocked by their results, but they recognized their racial biases and reflected on them in their personal responses to the test. So, how does this impact the children? Exclusionary discipline includes suspensions, expulsions, or sending kids out of class, and it disproportionately attacks students of color. In Wymer et al.'s article from the NAEYC, it describes how these practices tell children you don't belong here, cutting them off from learning while reinforcing the very negative behaviors they're meant to address. If this were just about bad kids, we could fix the children. But research says it's something different. The problem is the system, it's not the children. Let's look at first versus second generation equity. Jen Neitzel, the executive director of the Educational Equity Institute, explained in her book published by the NAEYC in 2021 that early efforts tried to fix children of color due to their culture, language, families, and economic status. Second generation equity work targets systems such as policies and practices that create discipline disparities from the start. Many teachers believe that their exclusionary practices are neutral, but according to Lafayette and DeMarco in their article in Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology in 2020, teachers must face concepts of colorblindness, such as when they are operating from their own cultural reference. Second generation equity work recognizes differences in culture, language, families, and economic status. Next, let's talk about educator pressures. In my experience, educator pressures lead to exclusionary practices. Here's an example. A teacher has 27 preschoolers and one assistant teacher, and it's circle time. They have 20 minutes to read a book and talk about key words. Sally is crying because she misses her mom, so the assistant is consoling her and attempting to encourage her to listen to the story while the teacher reads. Jack suddenly gets upset because Joe is in his space and starts shoving him into Sally. Sally gets even more upset, so she then pushes Joe and he falls over into Jack's lap, who then starts to yell. Joe is black, speech delayed, and sometimes bites other children without much warning. When Jack yelled at Joe, the teacher thought Joe bit him and then sent Joe to the office to calm down for the third time this week. This story highlights how overburdened teachers with large classes, little support, and tricky time constraints will often choose to send a seemingly difficult child to the office so that they can finish their lesson. The solution, according to Garo et al., isn't blaming educators, but giving them tools through consultation and integrated training in cultural competence and classroom management. Now let's talk about what's missing: consultation and integrated interventions. Back to our friend Joe. The teacher keeps sending him to the office so she can finish her lesson. But what does that teach Joe? A missing piece here is that sending Joe to the office is not addressing the underlying classroom management problem. Lafayette and DeMarco give us a roadmap for reducing racial disparities, proposing that the answer is to combine social emotional learning, equity training, and data driven supports to change teacher knowledge, attitudes, and daily practice. To do this, they recommend consultation. A consultant would come into the classroom, look at the school, look at the teacher and the child, and identify the patterns and the variables that are leading up to exclusion. From there, the consultant would then help empower the teacher by establishing goals. If the systems create the problem, then we can fix the system using classroom tools. Here are some practical strategies that work. The first practical strategy is building teacher awareness. Urbani et al.'s practitioner report on early childhood teacher education and issues in teacher education 2022, written by educators in California, describes a program that treats early childhood as the on ramp to inclusion, and they highlight three responsibilities for teacher educators. Modeling inclusive practices, facilitating hard conversations about families' lived experiences, and engaging in continuous self reflection. In practical terms, that can look like educators reflecting on their own discipline decisions, asking themselves whose behavior they notice first, and using tools like the implicit association test as a mirror for self reflection, not as a label. The second practical strategy is replacing exclusion with inclusion. In Wymer et al.'s article, it states that implicit biases occur most often in ambiguous situations, such as when there are no clear procedures and the classroom issue is left up to the interpretation of the teacher. This gray area leaves room for bias to influence when a child is sent to the office. Focusing on relationships, understanding the why behind behavior, and implementing restorative practices. For example, having Jack help Joe up off the floor instead of yelling when Sally pushed Joe over, are all practical ways to replace exclusion from the classroom. The third practical strategy is sustained system supports. Garo et al. Highlights that the consultation approach decreases problem behavior and increases pro social behavior in children, and has helped teachers use positive discipline strategies while enhancing self efficacy. One solution for Joe's scenario would have been a consultant in the room who could work with Joe on personal space through play scenarios a few times a week and serve as extra eyes in the room when things go awry. This consultant would be able to educate the teacher on how to spot which situations make the biting worse, how to minimize those situations through engaging play, and see things through Joe's perspective. Lafayette and DeMarco also state that strategies must be integrated to be effective. This means balancing social emotional learning, classroom management, cultural competence, and racial equity training for teachers. All of these things work together. These strategies help us move from simply naming the problem to actively changing how we teach. First, we spoke about how implicit bias shows up in discipline in a clear pattern of disproportionate suspension and expulsion rates for Black students, reinforcing negative behaviors and sending a message that's wrong, that they don't belong in school. Second, we covered how the problem lies in systems through policies and practices that are perpetuated by intense pressure placed on educators with a lack of practical support. Third, we covered practical strategies teachers can use that work, such as consultation, teacher awareness, and inclusive practices. Let's fight our unconscious bias by spotting it in discipline, focusing on the systems and not the children, and giving teachers real tools that work. Every child deserves a fair start in life, and it's up to us to give that to them. Thank you for listening.